Right, hello. Today we're going to be talking about inflation and the macroeconomic effects of high levels of inflation. Very, very current issue because today in the UK we have high levels of inflation. Before you start this video, I'd like you to read this news article. It was out 5 days ago, and look that up on the BBC. Just Google that, and it has some fantastic data about the nature of the inflation that's going on in the UK right now, most of which I've put into the OneNote document, and we'll refer to that as we go through the essay today. Right. Please pause the video now and think about what your 2 points will be based on the fact of which me poser you're talking about and the diagrams that you will use. Okay. Now coming back, hopefully you've thought of 2 points that you could be using. What I'm doing may well be different to what you've thought of, so just be careful. And I'm really saying be careful with this because there is one very, very clear problem with doing this essay. A lot of people will say that if there is inflation, that may be caused by AD shifting to the right, as we see there. That's created demand pull inflation. However, as prices go up, that means that consumption goes back down again, and the macroeconomic effect of inflation is to shift AD to the left. That is not true. The AD curve is not changed by prices. It is not, or at least consumption is not changed by prices. All the reasons for changes to consumption are non-price factors. If you want to look at how that would actually change, you're talking about a movement along the AD curve, as you can see there. That's a little too technical, so don't worry about it if that's not completely clear. Right, definitions. Inflation, that surely should be our first definition, a sustained increase in the price level in a country. And the two diagrams that I've chosen, the first one is the neoclassical model. I think that's something we need to look at because it's not something necessarily that we do a lot. And the second one is inequality, something that we've used in a lot of different essays, and I'd really, really recommend using this Lorentz curve. It's very useful and it gives a nice balance to your essay. So, first point, wage price spiral and macroeconomic instability. See if you can create a chain of reasoning to support that first diagram. And once you're there and if you found something, then think about how you might evaluate using some of the data that you saw in the article. I pause it. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've thought of some good ideas there. So I've created quite a long chain of reasoning here. Essentially what I've said first of all is that high savings after lockdown, it doesn't really matter what you do, but you could start off with a scenario, and that could be that consumption is going up after lockdown. We've had lots of QE, lots of money supply in the economy, low interest rates, lots of government spending, for example, and that shifted AD to the right. I know that there are other cost push factors as well going on at the moment, the war in Ukraine, for example, and energy prices and all those sorts of things, and we'll talk about those in a minute. At the moment, that's not really that important. All we need to get to is the fact that we have some inflation. Now, the point that we're trying to make in this paragraph is that inflation, is really where we're starting the argument, P1 to P2, demand pull inflation, results in inflation being above the target. It's currently 10.4%, key piece of information you need to know going into the exam. And when workers see that, they will think that they will feel poorer. Their real incomes will have fallen. And once they start to feel that, and they think that this inflation will continue, they will try to negotiate higher wage settlements. They'll try to negotiate higher wages. That could be through trade unions. It could be individually. And if they're successful, then the costs for firms will rise. And on our diagram, we'll see that SRES will be shifting back to the left. So the overall outcome has been purely inflationary. But the impact of the initial inflation in the long run is further inflation, and that then becomes something called a wage price spiral, which is, as we said at the beginning there, very, very, very worrying. It's a very big concern to a central bank. So we can see the cost push inflation kicking in there. It's certainly happening at the moment. We'll show that in a minute, and you'll see lower growth as a result. And the big problem, and you may or may not mention this, it depends if you've got time, but if it takes hold, then workers who experience increases to their nominal income, that is, that they see more money in their bank account each month, they then go and spend more, not realizing that actually they're not richer. their wages went up by 5%, prices have gone up by 10%, but they think that they will spend more. And that may further fuel inflation and then further fuel future wage demands as well. You could then go back to macroeconomic instability and talk about confidence, particularly corporate confidence, not knowing your future profits and revenue and so on. Right, eval. Well, it depends on the nature of the inflation. So you might want to think about magnitude here. You might want to think about what time period is that we're talking about. Take a look at the data and then come back and think about what you can write there. Pause it now. Right. So what have I said? Well, there are many causes of inflation at the moment, but many of them are external shocks. And that's slightly different to what we've said above. They may suddenly change in the future. So the war in Ukraine, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's going to happen with energy markets? We know that because of the sanctions on Russia, energy is very high in price. That's generated inflation. We know that a lot of commodities like wheat, for example, grown in Ukraine, that they have gone up in price. If Ukraine can go back to producing those goods, if the sanctions come off, then all of these external shocks will then fall out of our inflation again. Now, the point of that is that this then feeds into what workers expect. If they think that inflation is going to be short term, this is just a short term thing, it's just this winter and it will be fine next year, they may not be so aggressive in their wage demands. And we can see quite clearly that in the private sector, we've seen 7% increases in wages. In the public sector, only 4.8%. You may think about why that would be. That's the monopsony power of the employer there. That is, the government can sort of dictate and set public sector wages. And you can see that there. Clearly, and particularly with the public sector wages, you can see that inflation has taken hold back in June, or maybe back in the beginning of 2021, and it's taken quite a long time for public sector to then react. So we can come back to this diagram and say, well, actually the shift to SRAS is going to be delayed. And if the inflation then comes back down again before the workers realize and before the trade unions start to strike and negotiate higher wage settlements, then we may have a situation where it's not a problem. However, if it continues, we might see in the long run, we might see strikes, as we have seen with nurses, with doctors, with teachers as well. And there's only so long that the government may be able to hold out against those unions. And you could even go further and say, well, how powerful are those unions? There's less unionization in the UK right now. Fewer people are members of unions. And so therefore, maybe they don't do that. There's a lot of debate there about whether this will create higher wage demands or not. Next point is going to be inequality in the distribution of income and wealth. Think about it. How does inflation impact the top and lower quintile of the income distribution? Plan it out and then come back and see what I've done. Right. Key thing for this, and we've done this before, is looking at initial position and then the next position. So I've put in these two bits of knowledge there, the gap between the bottom and top quintiles, and I've used those words quintiles, and I've used the Gini coefficient. Now the Gini coefficient formula there is different to probably what you have seen in a textbook, because we have now three areas, because we've got two curves, and you can see me just highlighting these areas here. They are slightly different because we have added a curve and shifted it to show the change in income inequality. Now the difficult bit, I don't think there's anything difficult there. Every time you talk about the Lorenz curve, please do that and show the beginning and the final position. However, the difficult bit I think that we're talking about here is linking it to inflation and the nature of inflation. We know that the CPI, the measure of inflation, that 10.4% rate that we saw there, is only based on a typical basket of goods, with the weights reflecting typical proportions of consumers' income spent on those goods. So for example, energy may have a high weight and trainers may have a low weight because we spend less money on trainers than we do on energy. But that doesn't reflect every quintile accurately. And we can see that for low income quintiles, they may well experience higher rates of inflation than high income quintiles. What if necessities go up at a higher rate than, say, luxuries? And we can see that from our breakdown. The first chart you can look at is the breakdown here. We can see that housing and bills, particularly bills energy, have gone up by an incredible amount. Food and drink by 18%. So the biggest two ones there, the two areas, possibly less housing, but certainly bills, energy, food, are going to be going to hit the poor by a greater amount. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who did this chart here, clearly showing that 12.5% for the bottom income quintile, 9.7% for the top income quintile. Not as big as I thought, but still, even though it's still significant. So if we say that food and energy represent a higher proportion of low-income household spending, we can use that key word. It is regressive. It has a regressive effect. And therefore, the real incomes of the poor quintile fall more than the rich. Now, everyone's real incomes are falling here, but real incomes for the poor are falling by a greater amount than the rich. And that's going to shift the Lorentz curve inwards. It's going to raise the Gini coefficient. As we see, the gap between top and bottom is going to widen, and real income inequality is going to widen as well. And as a result, we might also, if the question wanted you to talk about wealth as well, you could talk about asset prices and housing going up. We saw that house prices were going up by a lot there as well, 26 point, however much percent it was there. That's going to then drive wealth inequality because it's the rich who disproportionately own housing. Right, how do you evaluate that? Well, think about it. What parts of inflation can you use to evaluate that point? Pause it now and come back. I realize I'm against time here a little bit. It really does depend on which goods are rising in price. And different poor income groups will be spending on different things. I've just chosen transport here. It's only gone up by 2.9%. So if you spent a lot of your money on transport, you may well have a lower effective rate of inflation than, say, another group of people. So not all poor people are the same. They're not all going to be spending the same amount on those areas, and so that it's not the same for all. So you can kind of make it talk about the regressive effect being different for different people. It certainly does depend on the level of government intervention as well. You might bring in what the government is doing right now. There was an energy price cap. There are policies at the moment, £400 payment to those people who are affected by these energy price increases, and so you can talk about the progressive effect of those policies. Do go and have a look at those policies. I haven't got time to talk about them in too much detail, but do go and look at them. They're very interesting, and they may well give you a lot to talk about here. Right, and finally, in judgments, well, how are we going to judge this? Well, a judgment is always nice with the short run and the long run, and we want to be very clear about whether it's a problem or not. I'm going to go and say, well, this is not a problem. This is actually not a problem in the short run. It's not a significant issue. The government is holding down wage demands in the short run. I think a lot of people have expected it to be a short run issue, an external issue, and so haven't asked for higher wages. However, it threatens to be a very significant issue if it becomes embedded. And therefore, we could then link back to what the Bank of England have done by raising interest rates in the context of the UK wider. This is why it's so important to know what's going on at the moment. In the context of the wider interest rate policy, 4.25%, rates have gone up very, very quickly. And therefore, aggregate demand is not going to be increasing as it may have otherwise done. And therefore, we're likely to see inflation expectations being lower and possibly workers demanding lower increases to their wages as well. But it's all uncertain. It's very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen in the world. It's a very uncertain place at the moment. War is happening. We've got lots and lots of friction between countries. So we just don't know what's going to happen to global commodity markets, to energy, to food, for example. And so it may well be that these inflationary issues keep on going. And if they do, then the government may not have the same power to battle it that they do in the short run. And therefore, the inequality effects, it might be limited. It may not be limited. If it keeps on driving food price increases, then we may well see very, very significant changes. So it really, really does depend ultimately on the government policy and how it's battling it, and external circumstances. And in this essay, you're getting a lovely, really applied essay, really using some of the things that are happening at the moment. And I really encourage you to do just find out more about what's happening in the current economy, what's driving inflation. I think it's quite likely that this could come up given how important it is to the economy at the moment. Thank you for listening. I hope that was clear. How do I stop this? There we go.